Hello, everyone. This is Jeremy Maestas here with the NRCS, and today I'm going to be talking with you about the Rangeland Analysis Platform and how I use it in conservation in sagebrush country. So, as a reminder, if hopefully you caught the talk by Brady Allred and Matt Jones with more details about the Rangeland Analysis Platform. Just a quick recap. RAP is both spatial data in the form of vegetation cover and herbaceous biomass, and it's a web application that puts that data at your fingertips. And you can access that at rangelands.app. Now, I want to share with you first a mental model of how I use RAP and other map-based tools as part of a larger decision-making framework on rangelands. I want to remind you, this is just one tool in the toolbox, right? This isn't going to replace your field sampling or knowledge or your local data. It's meant to build upon that and help you gain a better understanding of the land. One specific example of how I'm using this is to tackle rangeland threats. And this example here is cheatgrass and invasive annual grasses. Huge problem in sagebrush country and the biome depicted here. And RAP is actually helping us understand how this problem is changing through time at huge scales. And so you can see here depicted is annual grass and forb cover from RAP for the last 30 years, showing the change and where this invasion is getting worse. And we're using that information with partners to help develop strategies. And one important concept that remote sensing maps can help us deal with is context. And here's an example. The red box on the left here represents a landscape that's dominated by annual grasses, but has a couple of patches of uninvaded lands left in it. And contrast that with the one on the right. Blue landscape is hardly any invasion, but you got a few weed patches in it. Which one of these landscapes do you think you're going to be more effective in the long term in controlling invasions? Of course, the one on the right, that blue landscape, if we're able to target our resources there proactively, we could potentially get rid of that invasion before it spreads. Also, on the landscape in the left, knowing what's around you really helps you set reasonable expectations for what management might achieve, which can be very important for us to just cope with problems once they become really bad. So partners in Idaho recently took this concept and put it into practice. And they launched this effort called the Cheatgrass Challenge. They developed a map using the RAP data to identify core areas in their state that were still relatively uninvaded by these invasive annual grasses. And they use those core areas as anchor points to prioritize management. And so they set up a strategy for proactive management that starts with defending those core areas from invasion, growing them and making them bigger through restoration. And then in areas that are already heavily invaded, there is a recognition that we need to mitigate those impacts through things like fuel breaks and targeted grazing and those other practices that are simply coping with the worst of the impacts that have already occurred. So this has been a huge breakthrough. Partners around the West, including the Western Governors Association, have picked up on this in their invasive annual grass toolkit and starting to really operationalize the use of RAP and other remote sensing products in solving rangeland problems. So let's go away from invasive annual grasses. I want to show you one other example quick from the Highline of Montana. This is an effort that Matt Jones helped the Ranchard Stewardship Alliance up there evaluate production on CRP lands that were potentially expiring from that Conservation Reserve Program contract and might actually be grazing lands or transitioned into working grazing lands over time. But there was a desire to understand what the potential was in the productivity. And so in RAP, you have herbaceous biomass data you can pull up to look at how productive are those sites, and how have they changed through time. You can even pull together separately the NRCS soil survey data that will give you an idea on each soil map unit. What does production typically look like on dry years or favorable wet years? And this is just an example from those 3 CRP fields, each one depicted by a red line here. And you can see how the productivity fluctuates over time relative to kind of those static benchmarks from our soil survey. If you want an even more detailed look, you can drill down into the 16-day biomass data on RAP to almost track production in real time. And I'll just walk you through this one pasture here delineated on the left. And here's an idea of what's been happening the last 35 years in terms of a annual growth curve for new biomass production. And we'll pull up years that we know in history. In 2005 was a really wet year on this particular site, and we can see that play out on this curve. It started earlier. We got more biomass growth overall. Compare that with a dry year like 2008, and we didn't quite get the production that met our historical average there. And we can also take a look at how are things shaping up this year. And so this is data from 2020. I'll just show you as an example, but every 16 days, RAP will be updated with the latest estimate of herbaceous biomass. So you can literally see, are we on course for a quote normal year or below average year, or how are things playing out? Or are things just delayed because we had a cold spring or something? So endless possibilities here when it comes to thinking about your grazing management operation and the decisions for adaptive grazing management that you might be able to make. So in closing, I just want to wrap up with a reality check that, sometimes data doesn't meet your expectations when you drill down to your local place. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. What you want to do is consider the caveats of the data. There's always limitations and error. There's also land use history you might not be aware of. So when you see things unexpectedly, you should be looking back to see, well, what don't I know about this place? What might have happened that is producing this result? Don't obsess over error. All products are going to have some error. Even field sampling has error that we fail to acknowledge a lot of the times. And so if it doesn't work for you in one specific instance, don't throw it out altogether. Just set it aside and use other forms of information to answer that question. And then finally, challenge your own paradigm. Maybe the data are telling you something if you see a contradiction there. So just be willing to think outside of the box and see if perhaps this is telling you something you didn't know before. And always keep in mind, this is just one piece of a much larger decision-making framework. Thanks for your time, and please feel free to reach out if you have questions.